And that'll be true yet again because today I'm going to try making some pixel art the old-fashioned way on graph paper from your school notebook. Actually, I guess the old-fashioned way would probably be either cross-stitch or like ancient Roman tile mosaics. But either way, most of the time that I am doing pixel art, it's usually in the digital sense. So I always find it a bit exciting to see it in forms that have a bit more tangibility to them. Like when people make perler bead art or even just seeing pixel art printed in books or posters and stuff like that. So the graph paper idea is kind of along those lines, and I'm warming up here by recreating my Nano logo just to get a feel for what it's like to make pixel art this way. For reference, the graph paper that I'm using here has 10 squares per inch, and the full sheet has a resolution of 70 by 90 pixels. I'm using a fine liner marker here, so I have a good amount of control to stay within those lines. And then for this particular one, to finish it off, I've added this yellow background using a highlighter, just because it felt appropriate to have some sort of like typical office or school stationery represented here as well. So that one was a simple exercise to start with, but next I wanted to try recreating a sprite that's larger and has more color to it. And the technique, if you can call it that I've settled on here was to kind of plot out the black line work using dots, and then color in little sections of it at a time. The character I'm drawing here is one that I made several years ago, before I started this channel even, and I chose this one because I've always thought the design was pretty fun, and also because it was arranged as this sort of summary layout, which provided a convenient reference to the line work and the color palette. So plotting this one out just required a lot of kind of intense comparison to that original image, and it wasn't until later on that I noticed I'd actually introduced a full extra pixel of space between the eyes and the mouth compared to how it is on the original. And I think when I saw that, my face looked very much like that controller plug on the Super Famicom. But, you know, that's just the thing with doing everything by hand like this. You know, at a certain point, you just got to roll with it, since you can't really undo things that have been laid down in permanent marker, right? Moving on to the coloring, this was definitely the most satisfying part of this whole process. Because with the line work already in place, it felt a bit easier to just be a bit looser with things in a sense. Because at the very least, the line work would sort of catch you on a few sides regardless. For most of the coloring here, I'm using these Prismacolor markers, and they've got a large chisel tip on one end and then a fine tip on the other end. So I'm using that fine tip, which actually ended up being about the width of the pixels that I had to color in. So that worked out quite well. I had to make a few compromises on selecting colors that would match the original, but overall I really just actually kind of liked picking out the various kinds of markers for this project. Admittedly, I don't have loads to pick from even, but I could see it being one of those rabbit holes that I'd enjoy having, like a big stationery collection for this sort of thing. One thing about these Prismacolors though is that they do bleed a fair amount, which seems to help for the color actually being able to blend together really evenly. But it makes it tough if you're trying to get crispy pixels with those lines. Still, I think the extra bleed on something like the flame sprite here was actually kind of cool because it just sort of made those pixels look like they were a little bit unstable, like they are on fire or something. So that ended up being a neat effect at least. Alright, so the first two exercises were good fun, but they were really just about recreating work that I've already made digitally. So for the last one, I wanted to try making something from scratch to see what it'd be like to create pixel art on paper without much of a safety net at all. The other thought that I had for this piece was that I wanted to leverage the novelty of creating all this by hand. So I'm going to do something that incorporates a bit of illustration work as well. So the idea here is going to be something with two halves to it. On the left side, I'm making a cartoony illustrated cat face, and then on the right side is going to be my pixel art, which will be this sort of mechanical cross-section of the cat. Imagining it as a robot underneath. I figured I'd go for this sort of imagery because it allowed me to improvise some details that can fill in that space, and that'd be a nice contrast between the illustrated and seemingly organic side and the pixely robotic side. Probably the biggest difference between recreating an existing design and doing this one entirely from scratch was that it was actually much faster to get this one plotted in, because I didn't have to spend so much time comparing to some existing artwork, you know, to make sure that it was correct the whole time. That basically freed me up to just go with the flow and adapt on the fly to what would look nice and what space was still available in the design. So this actually felt way more familiar to me in terms of just being able to get lost into that flow state with a piece of artwork, and it was actually quite nice to work on. For the coloring here, I wanted to lean into that idea of contrast a little bit more. So I'm using a wide variety of colors on the robot side with a combination of the Prismas and also a couple highlighters, and just using them to pop some of the individual little bits of detail from the line work design, as if there's different colors of wires and little bits of metal paneling and stuff like that. With the illustrated side, I've balanced this by using fewer colors, and they're also used more solidly, being these larger, smooth patches instead. The final touch here was a bit of penciling on the robotic side, which I've added to indicate the edges of where the overall silhouette would be. And so with that, here's the final result. A little bit cute, a